And one of the challenges that you have when you're the Regional Schools Commissioner, and you have a slightly different reporting line in this job than I would have had in my old job, is to try to ensure that there's a balanced argument happening in the DFE about the position of the arts and sport and other subjects like that, that for some reason at the moment don't seem to carry the same weight as other subjects in the curriculum, yet have the same degree of passion amongst them that children feel and families feel for them. I think in the time that I've been ahead, and I'm working with David from 1997 when I was at Deer Park, right the way through to today, there are three things that I think that I've learnt about how do you make great schools. And they're really obvious things, but they're going to punctuate the 20 minutes I've got this morning with you. The first one I think is about the only intervention that I know works long term is to improve the quality of teaching day in, day out, and to make sure that every teacher feels supported, able to take risks, able to experiment, but understands that balance between inspiring young people and helping them to achieve outcomes they never believed was possible in the past. And one of our challenges in the system is to move beyond the blunt tool of talking about requiring improvement teaching as if that's what happens every single time a teacher goes into a classroom. It may have happened when you went to watch them teach. It doesn't mean it happened the lesson after break. So that notion about pedagogy and how do you look at a pedagogical practice across a whole school is really important. The second thing I've learned is that underpinning that is great leadership, and leadership from every aspect of a school. So the quick anecdote I'll give you, on September the 2nd, I went to talk to the staff at an academy in Swindon, because that school in Swindon had been the highest improving school in my region, from being one of the weakest schools last year. And I wanted to say well done to the staff. So I went to the staff briefing in the morning, I thanked them for what they did, made some observations about the things I'd seen them do during the year. And then the head said, let's go for a walk around the school before you go. And I said, that's great, we'll do that. And he took me down the first corridor, and this must have been about the 4th minute of the academic year. And the first classroom we came across was a young person. It was her first lesson in the profession. So not only does the head come down, but the Regional Schools Commissioner comes with him. But I saw a teacher, first lesson of her career, functioning as a leader. Because what I saw that teacher doing outside her classroom was greeting the children outside with a smile on her face, talking about her expectations of today, tomorrow, and the rest of the year, told them what they were going to learn in the next 6 weeks, told them why she was so passionate about it, made sure they had the first piece of equipment in their hand when they went into the lesson, and those kids ran into the classroom. They were so inspired by that. That, for me, was a teacher as a leader, not an embryonic teacher in her first lesson, let alone her first year of teaching. And I guess those two things we would all agree on are pretty important. But I think the experience I had in my last role before I became the Regional Schools Commissioner in the South West, I was the Chief Exec of the Cabot Learning Federation, which when I left it had 12 academies around the Bristol area, secondaries and primaries. And I think I was convinced more than ever in that role about the power of collaboration. So my background, my roots, if I go back to my secondary education in Cardiff where I grew up, I didn't get the EBAC. I hope that's never asked about, but I don't have the EBAC. In my school, you had to choose science or Welsh. And Welsh wasn't included as a modern foreign language, sadly, otherwise I might have got the EBAC through that route. But the point being that the things that I was passionate about, and probably the only two subjects I was really strong at in school, were music and sport. And I think I carry that feeling of what I got from that, playing in orchestras, playing in bands, playing in teams, is about that sense of collaboration and teamwork. And for me, that's why I put on the screen behind me, building a collaborative base for the education system, is I think what really drives me, because we have lived through an era which Tim has described recently about what I describe as a bit of a quick fix era. We are so driven by the accountability measures. And a new accountability measure comes in. It's a bigger hammer to replace the last hammer that didn't quite produce what we needed it to do. That I worry about what will happen in 20 years' time, whether we'll still be talking about interventions. And in 25, 30 years' time, will we still be asking Year 11 to come back on Bank Holiday Monday for an exam preparation lesson? Or will we have cracked it because actually the system is getting stronger and getting better as we go through it? I'm only going to touch briefly on the kind of the historical period, but I use this slide a lot to try to position where I think we are on our journey in the education system, to try to help young teachers, but obviously leaders and CEOs make sense of where we are. And on the left-hand side is where I think we were from 2010 to 2015, and on 2015 going forward is where I think we need to get to, and I want to play a part in that. I want to be a voice from the system inside the Department for Education informing policy and practice. I won't talk about all of those, but the one I think that is most important is that one of the legacies of 2010, when we saw the rise from 200 academies, of which I was passionate about that first wave of schools to try to re-energize education in the inner city, to the point at which good and outstanding schools could convert. And we went from 200 schools to 5,000 in the last Parliament. There was a sense that doing that, making that change, changing your name, putting a new sign up, putting kids in a new uniform was going to change standards in our schools. And I always saw that as the entry point to that dialogue. And what I'm spending a lot of my time doing now, particularly with new multi-academy trusts, with new sponsors, is to say, don't create a structural dimension here. Don't create structural turbulence unless you're going to use it to do something different. And think about those pedagogical practices, the leadership practices, and the collaboration in your school. But we won't change anything unless we think leadership is the hook that we hang it on. And we have a lot of people in the country who are really talented leaders, who are overcoming the odds, whatever those odds might be, however they feel they're stacked against them, to produce extraordinary outcomes for children in this country. And we have a generation of head teachers, of which I would have been one, who became the first generation of people to go and lead multiple groups of schools. And that's a really important part of what happens next. And some of the work that we see happening through the Institute of Education, through future leaders, through teaching leaders, is giving people the opportunity to think beyond their own context about what leadership will look like. But if we don't get leadership right, we won't reform our system. So I start by talking about some questions which I think are relevant, and you could probably substitute the word leadership for teaching, but this morning I just want to talk about leadership, because I think these are four very important questions about what leaders are about. Do the skills remain the same, but the scale and the scope change? I think that's true, having led one school, 12 schools, and now trying to have an influence across a whole southwest region, which is in excess of almost 2,500 schools. What the values are and the beliefs that I hold about what great education looks like is what drives me through those difficult conversations when it's becoming difficult. Do they mature with challenge? I absolutely think that's true. David Crossley appointed me as a deputy head, and I became his successor in 1997, and I think I'm a different leader today, 16, 17 years on, than I was at the time. What makes you mature with challenge is not just the experience, but the scars that you wear are the things you got wrong. And I got an awful lot more wrong than I got right. But as a result of it, the things I got right go better because I learned from that experience. Do they transmit to others if you model them well? Absolutely, I think they do. I think if you look at people that we work with, sometimes it's about saying, I never want to be like that, but that's a good reflection. That wasn't about you, by the way. As I said it, I thought I'd better clarify that. But it also works in reverse as well, because actually you do want to be like that. You want to be the kind of leader that you think inspires you in that respect. And do they change to reflect the political landscape? I really, really hope not. Because actually, if that's true, then we build an education system on something that is very, very fragile, because the beliefs and values that underpin what we do in our schools, I think, drives what we do next. I think there are 7 stages of leadership. I gave you an example of that fantastic young lady in the Swindon Academy that I saw on the first day of term. But I'm also thinking about, in primary schools, when I visit them, I get shown round corridors by year 3 and year 4 children who are leaders. I go to student council sessions in year 6 or year 11, or led by sixth formers. I'm seeing leadership working. Leadership is not about gathering experience like a carriage clock that you can't be a leader in your school until you have done 5 or 6 years. One of the challenges in secondary education, I think, is the year 6s who come up into year 7, who've had brilliant leadership experiences, go to the bottom of the pile again, and they have to earn their spurs. It's the same way as people who change career and come into teaching as NQTs have led teams and been managers in other industries, but we treat them as if they don't have that experience. So I like the idea that we build a pattern of what 7 stages of leadership might look like. You'll see a theme around the number 7, but I also think there are 7 progression points for young people. If we were to come at an education system that we had never created, and we were sitting down today to design it, I don't think we design primary and secondary schools. I think we design schools. Because I think one of the real challenges that we have is the fact that we break the most logical cycle of development from year 6 into year 7 by asking children to move to new buildings. Now, we're never going to be able to rebuild our school stock to create all through schools. But for me, one of the passions I have about multi-academy trusts is that you can create all through trusts where that understanding of what happens really works. So progression 4 is the one that most people understand because it's the most physically different one, because there is a change in the transmission from sight usually, and not just about learning. But I don't think progression 4 into secondary school, if that's the age of transfer, is any more challenging than when a 3-year-old goes to school for the first time, or your 19-year-old son or daughter goes to university. But my contention is that if we get those 7 progression points right, and we're really good at them, we will have the beginnings of a world-class education system. You'll see at the bottom it says each school leads on at one transition point. This is because I used this slide in the Cabinet Federation. And the first year I introduced what I called the progression charter. What's the experience of a 3-year-old up to a 19-year-old? I got the primary heads to lead progression 1 to 4, and the secondary heads to lead 5 to 7, and it was rubbish. The second year we flipped it, and the secondary heads led 1 to 4, and the primary heads led 5 to 7. It was more challenging, because there's a lot of knowledge that's wrapped up in those progression points. But if I did one thing that deepened my colleagues' understanding about all through learning, it was that. And getting secondary heads to really understand and review and challenge the kind of experiences that 3- and 4-year-olds were getting when they came into school. And primary heads understanding that actually when that early years practice is just superb, that year 13 teacher who gets a really good performance review because half their kids got A stars at A level should write that reception teacher a thank you letter because it's part of that journey. I think there are 2 intelligences that we need to build this collaborative leadership model. You'll be very familiar with the one on the right. There's a lot of research and writing about emotional intelligence, and I think naturally as teachers we gravitate towards that. I pair it with something that I call impact intelligence, which is knowing what to do to improve a school. How do you get your year 8 attendance up? How do you improve phonics? How do you build a curriculum structure? How do you manage your budget? All those technical things that you have to get right in order for great outcomes and great learning to take place. But what I've seen on my work in the Southwest is a number of schools where the head and the leadership team are really strong on impact intelligence. They really do know how to improve a school. And it's very innovative, it's very dynamic, but the ideas don't get past the classroom door. And the leadership team keeps telling themselves it's working. I also see schools which are really happy, high morale, emotional intelligence schools, often requiring improvement, because actually they haven't been able to combine the ability to take people on a journey with doing the right things to improve standards. And when I talk about leadership work in the Southwest, I talk about these 2 intelligences. I'm sure there are more, but these are the 2 things that I think go hand in glove. And when you're working in a collaborative environment, it's really more important. When you're trying to lead change across a system as opposed to a single school, I think change looks more complex. The green, brown, and orange boxes, I think, are very familiar to you in terms of we need to do something, we need a plan, we need to take people with us, we need to execute the plan. I think in a collaborative setting, the challenge is this, that if you have a concept in your head of if 80% of this change works, it'll produce this outcome. In a collaborative leadership model, you'll be lucky to get to half of that in the first round of change. And the best leaders in collaborations go back and they revisit that and they do the cycle again. Because the bits that are fundamentally going to make the difference, long-term sustainable change, happen in the red box, where you then shine the light on the bits that haven't been easily changed and need to be remodeled and rethought about. There are some real system-wide challenges at the moment about schools in isolation. So whether you believe or not, as I do, about the force of collaboration and the power and the impact of working together, there is a very real issue about how hard it's going to be for schools to stay on their own. And you'll recognize quite a few of those behind me there in that way around. But I think the notion that if I'm head of a school that has been given a category judgment or requiring improvement judgment, and we talk about what we do with those schools, what I see characterized by that leader is incredibly hard work, huge hours, huge activity, but it's a little bit like throwing a bit of mud at the wall in the hope that some of it will stick. When you work in a collaborative setting and everybody else is working on it with you, you can be much more forensic about that. My view in the Cabinet Federation was that if one of our schools got into difficulties, it reflected on all of us. It wasn't about saying, well, wow, look what they did. With a bit of luck, they'll improve in 2 years' time. We have to put the wagons in a circle and help. That's an important part of that collective responsibility of when we work together. The benefits, well, I think that first one I talked about there a moment, that notion of collective responsibility. If one school fails, we all fail. I think is very true. It's very true for parents. Very true for parents. If you work in a collaboration and there are 4 good schools and one of those schools drops from a 2 to a 3 on an Ofsted inspection, parents start to worry about whether their schools are as good as they thought they were. So it does have a ripple effect, a real ripple effect around the community when that happens. I think there's something about transmission of best practice, but I'm going to very briefly do an anecdote. I was one of probably about 1,000 head teachers in the country, and some of you in the room may have done the same. And we bought the Thomas Telford IT course back in around about 2000 because we saw that, as many did, as a silver bullet to get our 5A to C grades up. It was an online IT course that was self-assessed, gave marking feedback to children, but was worth 4 GCSEs. And that was the carrot. And we did it in John Cabot when I went there, and we stopped using it just after October half term. So I gave you an example. I'd made mistakes. There's one I'm confessing to right here. But the reason was this, because what we bought was a curriculum that had been written by the Thomas Telford teachers for their children. So therefore, my staff would be teaching cover lessons, effectively. They were teaching somebody else's schemes of work, somebody else's lesson plans. All the case studies were Shropshire, which wasn't very helpful in Bristol. However, the bit that was really interesting was the principle of an online course that gave kids feedback that was maybe worth more than 1 GCSE. Those are the DNA aspects of that. So in Cabot, we wrote a BTEC PE course that did the same things, but we owned it. It was ours. So the lesson from that was, it wasn't about taking a product and saying, you now have to start doing this. It was about saying, let's look at the DNA that sits behind that product, that curriculum, that idea that we think will make a difference, and let's see how we take that practice and embed it. I think there's a question about partnership with autonomy. I think you have to be honest and say that when you're working in a formal collaboration, it probably does mean that there's a change of autonomy. I've been married twice. My second wife absolutely understands I am less autonomous with her than she thought I was. And she makes that point quite frequently to me. But here's the key to it. If autonomy means that some of our operating systems are the same, to enable us to look at year 6 and year 11's data at the same time in the course of a year so we can plan our interventions around it, that's a good thing. If we employ all of these people together, we can't have one group of people treated differently here to over here. That's a good thing. However, if autonomy means that we try to enforce the culture of a school, or we think about a standardized model of enrichment, you can only run extracurricular activities if it's these things, or actually the networks and the partnerships you had before you joined this collaboration, you can't do that anymore. That's not what I mean by that. So I think there is an intelligent conversation as the system matures about what that looks like. So we do need more CEOs, we do need more executive leaders, and these are some of the skill sets they need to have. So when I asked those 4 questions earlier on about, is it about scale, is it about scope? Yes, it is. Some of those things there are very clearly about the challenges and the skills that you need to lead a single school. But if I think about the visions, values, and beliefs, for example, the Cabot Learning Federation mantra, mission, if you want another word, was that the Federation had to be brilliant at supporting and improving the life chances of vulnerable children. Bristol had lots of them, and most of them came to our academies. And so therefore, how do you live and breathe that very generic statement across 12 academies? When I started the Federation, it was as simple as this. When I was in John Cabot, I used to do staff briefing in the morning. When I was at Bristol Brunel Academy, I did bus duty in the afternoon. And the staff thought I'd been in both schools all day. So it's about the visibility and how you take those opportunities to talk about what you believe in and how you do that. And that changes the way that you communicate. It changes the way you think about using data. You can no longer have an idea on a Monday morning and implement it by Wednesday. You have to think about how you take those change agents with you as you go through it. And I think these are the performance challenges that we face as a country. You would use this slide in the Southwest, but I think it's true. Number one, you'll be very clear with, The work that John Dunford has done needs dissemination across the country. There's too much good research that's gone on for us to lose sight of that. But I think in the Southwest particularly, I've got a challenge with our most able children. We see the children that get 3 level 5s go and do really well at GCSE with A stars and A's, leaving with an average of 3 C's at A level. And whether or not you believe university is right for all, I personally don't. I think it's about advice and guidance. 3 C's won't get you into the university that your Key Stage 2 results suggested you might be capable of doing. The culture of continuous improvement talks to number 4 about growing the top. How do we help our best schools get better? Or do we end up with a bulge around kind of quite good, nearly requiring improvement? Because that wouldn't be great for a system either. How do we help people in senior decision-making positions understand that poverty and deprivation is different in the rural location to what it is in the urban location? And there is more rural poverty than there is urban poverty because of the nature of our country. It's not the same thing, and the strategies aren't the same. And number 6, I've mentioned several times, how do we encourage and inspire our best leaders to go forward and lead our system? The challenges in schools today, these are the ways in which I think we overcome that. So that young teacher at Swindon, she's got enough on her plate for the moment, but next year I'm sure they'll start to think about her as a potential middle leader. She needs to become a great coach. She needs to learn from a great coach. She needs to continually practice her teaching. If the vulnerable children in her school don't perform well, it shouldn't be in her class. She should be the model to share with others. She shouldn't avoid those difficult conversations, because every day you avoid a difficult conversation, it doesn't get easier, it gets harder. And you have to look beyond your context. So she's working in a largely white working class school in Swindon. But her next job or her next experience should be, I think, in a more diverse community, so she can test her skills in that way. And my final point, and I'll finish with this, is so what do we do to help our leaders develop further forward? They need to watch. They need to observe leaders around them. They need to imagine, as I did, whether I could become the head of the people that I'd worked for. She should look at leaders working in different contexts. Within her own school would be a good start. She should be an avid but critical reader. Twitter, for example, has some of the best CPD available. It also has some of the biggest rubbish you'll ever read. And you have to, probably you're doing it now maybe, the good stuff that is. And maybe we should be really critical about that. But the way that we can communicate through social media, the practice and the success is terrific. I do like the idea of a learning journal. I'd started that when I did an MBA with Brent Davis many years ago. I keep it up every 3 or 4 weeks now, just reminding myself of the things I've done and the decisions I've taken. I think there's a need to understand that journey of the 3-year-old to 19-year-old. And that's difficult if setting is part of that, but the ways in which collaborative practice is working is helping it. And I think finally, you need to learn to delegate well. That's the hallmark of a leader. But you substitute delegation by being really good at holding people to account. It's not an absolution of your responsibility. But I wasn't a great delegator to start with. You have to become quite good at delegation when you've got 12 schools. Otherwise, you're going to die. So I think the idea of being able to delegate, build leadership capacity, but hold those people to account is part of it. Thank you for listening.